Yeah.
I welcome Honorable VC Sir in absentia, Professor Dr. Faizan Mustafa Sir, respected faculties, and to my dearest CNLU family, a very warm greetings on such a delightful noon. I, Aditi Anand, on behalf of the CNLU Book Club, welcomes you all to meet the author event where we have the privilege of hosting renowned author Mr. Arghya Sengupta. Can we have a huge round of applause? Talking about the least, Arghya Sir is founder and research director at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, New Delhi, India. He graduated in law from the prestigious National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and obtained his BCL from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. While at Oxford, he completed his GPhil on independence and accountability of the Indian higher judiciary. He regularly advises the Union of India, state governments, and regulatory authorities on a range of legislation and regulation. As we all to introduce the members on the dais, we have Honorable VC Sir, Mr. Arghya Sengupta Sir, Mr. Vishwan Prakash Sir, and Apur, the first year member of our book club, who has completely read his book, The Colonial Constitution. Before starting with the event, I would like Dhananjay and Neerul to come up for the book signing and the book launch event. Readers, the book would be placed in the library for you to read. Thank you so much, sir. Before starting with the event, just a few housekeeping notes. Please ensure that your phone is on silent mode. If there is any call, please attend it outside the hall. Secondly, there will be refreshments. Kindly make sure that you keep those refreshments based with you. There would be people that would be collecting it. Please don't go and outside and make this a chaotic event, please. Now, coming with the event start, I would like to introduce Apur to come up here and give the introduction of the book.
So I was just looking at the cover of the book. The cover accurately represents what the book tries to convey through its text. There is this British symbol of the British India flag, and the flag covers the Constitution of India's preamble, uh, which says that the Constitution of India was not something that was very radical, a different text altogether, but it was something that was copied from the most of the parts from the Government of India Act that was passed by the British Parliament in 1935, and the the basic points on which the freedom struggle was started and was fought against the British was the Gandhian principles and many other values were not even discussed in the constitutional assembly debates. Most of those principles or things are just mentioned in the directive principles, uh, in the which are not even justiciable by the courts. Uh, the story of Ustad Mangu, Tongawala, is discussed in this book, who was very happy when the Government of India Act came into place, and he was shouting, and then he also beat up a British soldier, saying that there is a naya kanun, but they just uh, took up and put him in jail and say that koi naya kanun nahi hai, it is the same old thing, you fool. So when moving to the next chapter, which talks about, there are two sections precisely, the decisions and the alternatives. Decisions are the things which were discussed in the constitutional debates, assembly debates, and which were not, and which was actually took the form of the text, and alternatives are those which could have been but didn't came into the constitution. Uh, Okay, so Bharat was the Gandhian principles, the on the constitution, which was a very small uh, a princely state in Maharashtra, which showed how a Gandhian constitution would look like. From the like the concentric circles, the power was concentrated in the smallest point, and then the power was distributed outside, making the king of that place a titular one. Uh, but this was not actually used in the Indian constitution, and this was completely discarded, making the union the most powerful one, and the states were not given that much power. Even during the emergency, which was a thing that is discussed also in this book, is that Government of India Act when came, in section 93, it discussed about giving the powers when the government worked irresponsibility directly to the Governor General, who was not elected, who was not even elected by the people, and it was the British officer. And that same power was used in emergency provisions here, that if any state government does not work properly according to the constitution, the power will be transferred to the union government. Even this section was deleted by them before they went back to to Britain, but this was kept by our constitution somehow. Well, that was my version. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Apoor, for this insightful insight on the book. Before starting with the actual event, I would request all of you to not question right now. The floor would be open after half an hour. So in that time, you can ask questions. Kindly let the event go smoothly within this half an hour. So I request Vishwam Prakash sir to come up on the podium.
I will come up.
Sure.
In the spirit of decoloniality, I will sit and speak. Since standing and speaking has a political background to it, I think sitting and speaking is a somewhat less daunting exercise both for the speaker and the reader. I will start with about something that Apoor already discussed, which is the cover of the book. It is the preamble of India, the Indian Constitution. Superimposed upon it is the Union Jack. It is convenient that the Union Jack looks a lot like prison bars, perhaps intentionally or not, I am not sure. But the fact that the preamble has this superimposed Union Jack upon it is the idea that the Indian Constitution has an overtone of what can be called what can be called the colonialization of the mind, right? So sometimes even if you are refuting or resisting English rule, maybe you do it in an English way. And in that sense, maybe the English go away, as Gandhiji said, and he's quoted it in the book, but that India remains English tongue, right? The first chapter of the book is titled Mangu or Macaulay's Pride. Mangu's and Macaulay's Pride, right? And I'm sure you're all aware of the very popular statement by Macaulay that you want Indians who are brown in color but white in mind and in the way that conduct themselves. And he says that if Macaulay saw the Indian Constitution, he'd be very proud of the legacy that he left behind in India. Right? It was a bunch of Indians who were nationalists who had fought the freedom struggle, coming together to form a document for a new country and borrowing most of the provisions of that document from not just the Government of India Act, but from other provisions that had already worked in other parts of the world. It's also, I think, happenstance that the publisher of this book is Juggernaut. For those of you who know Juggernaut, the English word, of course, being the derivation of the Hindi word Jagannath, right? I think it's happenstance that the publisher also has some element of coloniality built into it. This
Author didn't design the cover page.
I'm sure.
Don't blame author for the cover page.
I'm saying that it's a happy coincidence that both the publisher and the cover are great sort of entries into reading the book. To start the discussion of the book, I'd like to actually give away the final ending of the book. And I'd like to read something which I found to be the most profound portion of the book. What the Indian Constitution did, as Sir mentions, is that it could restrain governments but not compel them to act. It could invest citizens with rights but not provide forums where they could understand each other better. It could set up courts as enforcers, not local mediators who could amicably settle disputes. It could declare India to be striving for liberty, equality, and fraternity, yet not be able to make citizens more sympathetic to the plight of fellow countrymen. This is perhaps why once the Constitution started functioning, Ambedkar had mixed feelings about it. While defending it as a beautiful document, he was quick to disavow his own role in drafting it. I was a hack. What I was asked to do, I did much against my will. Right? So only a few years after Ambedkar had helped draft this brilliant constitution, he was completely disenchanted by its magical power and said that I'd be the first person to burn it. What was that sort of angst against? Right? I think that the angst was against the fact that the Indian Constitution was also based fundamentally upon the same ideas about the Indian people upon which the British Government of India Act was based, which was that the people who were drafting that law did not have faith and trust upon the people upon whom the act was going to apply, constitution was going to apply, right? So that lack of faith ended up creating the kind of institutions in which it is completely visible that they don't want to leave anything up to the people to decide, right? So as Sir mentions a very interesting article in the Constitution, which is about jute export duty, right? And the Constitution of a country mentioning how jute export dues will be paid off is a very interesting thing in itself. And yet he mentions that the Constitution that would think that it is important to mention jute export duty in the Constitution could not make the symbolic gesture of including the salt tax as a symbolic tribute to the freedom movement that had led to the creation of this Constitution. And perhaps it was discussed in the Constituent Assembly, but on practical grounds that what if sometimes a foreign company comes into India and we need to tax their soil production, the provision was not mentioned in the Constitution, right? And then we come to the most popular criticism of the Indian Constitution, which is that it is a lawyer's document. But it is criticized for being a lawyer's document for reasons that are not relevant to what is discussed in this book. The general argument for it being a lawyer's document is that it leaves scope for a lot of ambiguity, and it leaves scope for a lot of interpretation where lawyers can come in and say that we think that this provision should be read in consonance with this other provision, and because there are so many chapters and each chapter has to be read in consonance with the other, it creates sort of a paradise for lawyers to play their own games. But it's also a lawyer's document in a different way. It's a lawyer's document, and I'm sorry, this is my personal opinion. You might or may not agree, but lawyers are a little unimaginative. If you ask lawyers to come up with a new argument, they'll only find those arguments that it has already been made in the past, right? So if you can find precedent for something, then you will make that argument. Sorry. If you can find precedent for something, you can make that argument. But to create something new completely out of the blue is difficult for lawyers to do. And so, sir, as he mentions in the book, that the provisions which were picked up were the provisions that had worked elsewhere in the world. And so it was an easy thing to do for those people to just pick up the parts of the Constitution that had worked in other parts of the world and to take them into consideration in India, leaving aside the fact that this country was not just a country, right? The argument which is usually made about India is that it is not just a nation state, it's also a civilization. And that civilizational ethos is missing from the Indian Constitution, right? He mentions the ideas of Aurobindo, the ideas of S.N. Mukherjee, none of them being reflected in the Indian Constitution, and of course ideas of Gandhian constitutionalism being missing from the Indian Constitution. The reason why it is missing because it is a lawyer's document. So that civilizational ethos was never really imbibed into the draft of the Indian Constitution. And so what was the pragmatic solution to this is that whenever an idealist argument or an idealist amendment came up during the drafting of the Constitution, it was thrown into the dustbin of the Indian Constitution, which is the DPSPs, right? So if there were Gandhians in the assembly who said that we must have cow slaughter and we must have prohibition and we must have panchayat and all of that, then the people who were supposed to include that in the Constitution said, sure, let's put that in the DPSPs and we'll leave that up to the future generations of legislators to bring to life, right? And it's interesting that some provisions in the DPSP are completely contradictory to the provisions of the Fundamental Rights chapter, right? And still the DPSPs follow the Fundamental Rights chapter. And so the debate, of course, had to emerge as to which should be given precedence, and you know how that debate has been settled in the judiciary. But Sir then also is a little forgiving to the people who drafted this constitution, and he said that you also have to look at the socio-economic setting in which this constitution was being drafted, right? And that socio-economic setting is that India was being partitioned and there were communal riots going on at every part, and more in many parts of India, right? So a constitution that was being drafted at a time of uncertainty needed to be you needed to have a unitary bias, because you needed a strong state to bring together a country that was on the verge of organization, right? And so in order to have that state where the center could actually rein in all these divisive forces, you needed to create the sort of constitution that was created, with preventive detention being put in the Fundamental Rights chapter, right, which is unheard of anywhere else in the world. So having said that, perhaps it's a little we'll be a little too forgiving to the constitution makers if we say that it was only the socio-economic circumstances that led them to make this colonial document, because surely they could have found ways to get through this loophole and say that we will have a unitary bias, and yet it is not completely against the spirit of the constitution to have local governance, to have self-governance for village local panchayats, right? And so that's the first part of the constitution. And I'll ask sir to please elaborate upon this circumstantial dilemma of the constitution makers. The second part is far more interesting for me. Since the second part is divided into three chapters, each they are titled Bharat, Hindustan, and India. Right? So all three of them deal with three different aspects of constitutionalism that were alternatives that were either rejected, the final one being the Ambedkarite, India being the Ambedkarite version of the constitution, which was also not truthfully accepted, because just because Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee does not mean that the constitution reflects his true value systems, right? So the first chapter in the second part is the Gandhian constitution. I think this is a very interesting chapter, since most of the times when you will hear of what were the Gandhian alternatives to constitutionalism, you will hear a reference only to the Hindu Swaraj. But the fact is that I think this is the first time that I've read a book that mentions the Ond experiment. Ond, as Apoor said, was a princely state in Maharashtra, and Mahatma Gandhi lived very nearby in Wardha at the time, and there was an uprising against the Maharaja of Ond, and he requested Mahatma Gandhi to come and draft a constitution for him. So we don't actually have to think about what kind of a constitution would Gandhi have created, because he created one. Right? So we can simply look at that constitution, even though, as sir mentions, it was for a very small princely state, so it could not be extrapolated very easily to fit a large state. But even then, we have an on experiment where we know what the Mahatma's idea of a constitution was. Very surprisingly, you would think that Gandhi did not give universal adult franchise in this constitution. He only gave voting rights to educated, literate people. And the literacy rate in Ond was abysmal. And upon being told that, how can you give voting rights only to this small fraction of people, he said, well, then spend all of your budget on educating people first, before having the first elections. Right? So he was non-compromising on that part of giving franchise only to literate people. And there were, of course, other aspects from the Hindu Swaraj which were incorporated into the Ond experiment. And then there were other documents that sir has also discussed. Most importantly, the constitution, the draft constitution prepared by Sriman Narayan Agarwal was a Gandhian himself. And with great reference and with great insight from Gandhi himself, with direct dialogue with him, he created what is called the Gandhian Constitution. And I didn't know this, but I read this in the book, that when Gandhi was presented the final draft of the Gandhian Constitution, he said that the fact that it says Gandhian does not mean it is a complete reflection of my value systems, right? And this was a little disheartening for the author, since he had consulted Gandhi at every point, at every step of the way in drafting that draft, and yet Gandhi did not give it his full sponsorship, right? So the Gandhian Constitution, and finally something very interesting that sir mentions in the chapter of Gandhi, is that even though he had this idea of a duty-based society being the fundamental fabric of a constitutional democracy, he very eagerly promoted the Karachi resolution, right? So the objective resolution that was passed in Karachi. He was the person who sponsored it, right? So it's obviously a rights-based discourse that he said would bring Ram Rajya. So here is where Gandhi's pragmatism comes into play. That here's a person who does not believe in a rights-based system of governance, promoting what is a rights-based system. And I think that the reason why he did it, and I'd ask sir to also reflect upon why he did this, is because he also feared that if he had to choose between the utopia of what he dreamt of and the dystopia of what India was going to become in the absence of this constitution, he chose to avoid the dystopia rather than achieving the utopia, right? And this is the general theme of the Indian Constitution, that if you think that the Indian Constitution was meant to create heaven on earth, then that wasn't the case, right? It was meant to prevent India from becoming hell, right? So if you look at it that way, that it's not a constitution that makes heaven on earth, but prevents India from becoming hell, then maybe you will be more appreciative of its values, right? And then finally, I'll come to the question of the second and the third. And the second chapter is called Hindustan, which I think is very interesting. And I'll just finish in a few more minutes. The second chapter is called Hindustan, which discusses the idea of the Hindu Mahasabha. and the draft constitution which was drafted by the Hindu Mahasabha. So it tells us that the draft constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha was not so different from the Indian constitution that was drafted by the assembly. And so we still sit at a point of time where the Hindu right wing, their opposition to the Indian constitution is based on the ideologies of decoloniality. And yet we do not see decoloniality reflected anywhere in the draft constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha. As I mentioned, that it is perhaps because they had become a little unpopular in the mix of things, and therefore could not afford to be very radical in their draft constitution. But even so, I think it's very interesting to discuss how the move of right-wing ideology has been from accepting modern political values to now going back and saying that we want to decolonize the Indian constitution. Right? You're of course familiar with Sai Deepak's very popular book, India That Is Bharat, which is a defense for decolonizing the Indian constitution, very different from what you would read in this chapter on what the Hindu Mahasabha's conception of an Indian constitution was. And finally, Sir comes to Ambedkar and his fears of what would happen in a free India. And his fears are not completely given due voice in the Indian constitution. That is why his dissatisfaction from the draft that he has himself helped create, which now leads me to ask Sir to, I've already skipped more time than I should have. I'll ask Sir now to please. Okay. In the spirit of coloniality, Sir would like to speak from the dais. Thank you.
Thank you very much to first to Vishwam and Apur for making my job immensely easier than it would have been, because my book has been more expertly summarized here than anywhere that I've actually come and spoken before. So I think that makes my job easy as well as difficult, because then I have to think of other things to say since most of it has been said. But first of all, I would like to thank Professor Faizan Mustafa not only for being here, but also making me an adjunct professor at the Chanakya National Law University. It's my privilege and honor to be here, and this is my first official visit in that sense, and hopefully the first of many to come. And so I was wondering what, when Vishwam was speaking, I was wondering what I will now begin with. So I think what would be useful to begin with is, let's go back to the elections of 2024. And we found that the constitution had become a real centerpiece of the campaign on both sides. So there are many images of Rahul Gandhi holding up this red color small pocketbook constitution produced by Eastern Book House that many people have. And many press conferences where he's holding the book up and saying that the Modi government is destroying the constitution and we will uphold it. The response of the government was also equally interesting. It was not to say that yes, the constitution is problematic, yes, we need to change it in some ways, as some of the earlier statements had been. But rather they came back and said that we are now going to celebrate the 25th of June, or commemorate the 25th of June, which was the day the emergency was proclaimed, as Samvidhan Hatya Divas. So trying to say that actually it is the Congress that has decimated the constitution in the past, and it is their government that is actually upholding. So for the first time, at least in my memory, the constitution became a center point for an electoral campaign. And what was interesting was the fact that both sides were claiming the mantle of the constitution. But if we were, and since we are all members of the legal fraternity, it is our duty to ask this question, that what does this symbol mean? When they are holding up the constitution and say that I am protecting the constitution, and the other side says that no, you have decimated the constitution, I am protecting the constitution, what is it a symbol of? And here, my colleagues and I at Vidhi had done a small survey in terms of what people broadly understood this debate to be about. And I'm not going to get into the details of it, but broadly people understood this debate about reservations and caste-based reservations. That there was one side that is basically the opposition that is going to protect caste-based reservations, and the other side, which is the government, that wants to move away from caste-based reservations. Now, the government has said on many occasions that reservation on economic criteria is in addition to caste, but that has not held much water. So in the public mind, the debate about the constitution is really a debate about reservation and the ability to get government jobs and places in government educational institutions. But as lawyers and legal academics and law students, we have to look a little bit deeper. Because the constitution is a large document, it is a document that contains innumerable contradictions. It is not a document that we within the legal community can blindly celebrate or blindly criticize. We have to understand as to what are the parts of the constitution that require celebration and what are the parts of the constitution that require a relook. Doing this is not to support the BJP or to decry Ambedkar. Doing this is our duty as legal professionals who are in search of the truth. So it is in that spirit that this book has been written. And I'd like to repeat the familiar adage that don't judge a book by its cover. I think it's truer in this case than in any other. But this was basically done by the publishers to hope to sell a few extra copies, and I think in that they have succeeded. And I am quite happy about that fact. So if we are, as law students, going to look at the Constitution in some degree of detail, our Constitution, largely speaking, and this is academic commentary on the Constitution in the last 75 years, has tended to be celebratory. And there is a good reason for this celebration. Because there is no doubt that it was put together in less than 3 years' time. It represents a remarkable feat. To get consensus in such a widespread and diverse country in 3 years' time requires a remarkable degree of consensus. And look at the people who drafted it, right from Ambedkar to Alladi Krishna Swami Iyer, Meenu Masani, people from all parts of the country, all political dispensations coming together. This is something unimaginable today in today's political milieu. And so who, in some sense, while I'm reading out these names, as it's giving me goosebumps, so it's not as if we can very easily say that, what they did was rubbish. And, they have just copied something from elsewhere. They were acting in the circumstances of the time. And that time demanded a constitution that was a consensus document. And it demanded a consensus document because, as Gandhiji said in 1940, something that Vishwam referred to, is that the constitution should be one that brings justice and peace to all communities. I mean, this was basically in 1940, as in the Pakistan resolution had been passed by the Muslim League at that time. And it was clear to Gandhiji that the constitution need not be a perfect document. What is needed is that everybody should agree broadly. And what is that document on which everybody could agree? It was a document that already was existing. That is the Government of India Act 1935. If you had to reinvent the wheel, then that would take A, time, B, a large number of negotiations which people wouldn't do in that atmosphere. So that is why it was easiest at that time to take what was an existing first draft and edit it. And this is something that all of us do. We've done it in law school many times, as we take some existing draft or change it here, change it there, and then you present something that looks a little bit different. It is natural for all of us to want to do it. So the celebration of the Constitution, one, because of the enormous feat that went into its origins. The celebration of the Constitution, number two, the key reason is simply that the Constitution has sustained. And I think this is a remarkable feat in and of itself in a geography where the Constitution hasn't sustained in many countries around us, or has sustained with so many amendments that it is completely unrecognizable as the Constitution. It is an example of a Global South Constitution that has broadly held the field for 75 years. And that's a great thing. But just because something has held the field for 75 years doesn't mean that it is a perfect document or it will hold the field for 75 years more. I think the way all of us can ensure its longevity and that constitutional ideals continue to be nourished is by continuing to debate its provisions. I think there is a risk, and every time I hear this, I feel that this is a great risk because this is parroted not just by politicians, which I can expect, but also by judges fairly regularly in speeches, that the Constitution is like the Bhagavad Gita. It's like a holy book. Okay, this worries me immensely. Because the moment you are making something a holy book, then you are putting it as a place of worship. And the moment you are putting it as a place of worship, you are not engaging with its contents anymore. You are not making sure that this is something that changes and evolves with time. Whereas with the constitution, I will go so far as to say that it is not only not a holy book, I would say sometimes we should consider it unholy. Because what we need to do is that we need to debate its context. But all this is fine, but you may still ask, and this is a question that I have gotten asked, why is it colonial? This, of course, it is many things, but why do you call it colonial? So let me give a few reasons as to why I think this is so. Firstly, the constitution, we all know, and this is all in civics class, all of us are taught that the constitution is the longest document in the or longest constitution in the world, which it is of any country. But there is actually a deeper issue there. The deeper issue there, which is something that Vishwa mentioned, is that the constitution framers were overly prescriptive. And the reason they were overly prescriptive is that they felt, and this is something that both Ambedkar and Gandhi, despite grave disagreements on many issues, agreed, that India is not yet fully ready for democracy. This is why Gandhi in the House Constitution does not support universal adult franchise. This is why Ambedkar says that democracy is merely the dressing on the topsoil of India. Because it is clear to them that India has not had a history of democracy, at least in the recent past, and so we will have to be made ready for democracy. So till that time that India is ready for democracy, let the constitution prescribe. Let the constitution go into details. So that is why this provision that he mentioned, Article 273. Article 273 is a provision which provides grants from center to states, 4 states, Bihar, West Bengal, Odisha, and the 3 states now, Jharkhand, in lieu of their share of export duty on jute, because jute is produced by these states, it is exported. So once it is exported, they should get some of that money. Okay. They are not getting export duty because export duty goes to the center. So center is now going to give some grant in lieu of that export duty. Very important for these 3 states. They were poor states then, they are poor states now. It is important money. But surely, is this something that is important enough to be in the constitutional document in the country? There is a reason as to why it was provided. The reason is that the constitution framers felt that this is something that may not be worked out through negotiation, through the processes of politics. Maybe through the processes of politics, something better could have been worked out for the states. But it was felt that it is better to provide that certainty in the constitution. So that prescription comes from the fact that you did not want to leave something to democratic forces. This at its core is an idea that is born out of colonial rule, that let's not leave it to the natives. Let us now provide for the natives because we are enlightened and we know better. So secondly, the reason why I say, and this seems more something that is more understandable today than it would have been 75 years back, is that the constitution is written in dense legal jargon, right? I mean, you and I, we are all students of law, but we don't read the constitution like we read a book when we are going to sleep, right? It's not like you read word after word, so provision after provision, and you think it's unthinkable. We can't read a constitution like that. But why is it so unthinkable? Why could it not be written in simple English and simple Hindi and in simple languages in the 8th schedule of the constitution? It would have been done. It was a choice that was made. It was a choice that carried over existing practice. Fair enough. Again, as I said, it is because there was an existing practice, it was easiest to carry it forward. But this immediately meant that this, what in today's language is called a design choice. This design choice meant that 99% of the population didn't understand the constitution. They don't understand the constitution even today. That is why you think that the constitution, when this debate is happening, is perhaps a debate only about reservations. It may not be entirely wrong. Reservations may have a part to play in this. But surely, it behooves us as individuals to think more deeply about how the constitution was written. The third is about the question of institutions. And the recent Nobel Prize for Economics I saw was given to 3 economists who wrote this, really 2 of them wrote this great book called Why Nations Fail. And essentially Why Nations Fail is about a history of institutions. The institutions that you create as nations. And I think this is perhaps the single biggest difference between the post-colonial and independent trajectories of India and Pakistan, in terms of the institutions and the dynamic between the various institutions at play. Now, India, what it did was that it didn't want to change things too much and it perpetuated colonial institutions. Now, I mean, I'm not going to get into a direct comparison with Pakistan here. The question of the army is a big one, but we can have a different discussion on that. But the purpose was not to mark a decisive break from India's colonial past. In fact, it was very conscious that we don't want to change this from the past. So, if you want to take one example, the example which was, I mean, the institution that best exemplified the might of colonial rule was the Imperial Police Service, right? Because this is a police force that was putting all our freedom fighters in prison, I mean, and subjecting them to intense agony and torture. But when it came to our time to draft the constitution, we decided to continue the same police. In fact, we made a provision in the constitution, Article 312, which provides for all India services, made the Indian police, changed the name, of course, from the Imperial Police Service to the Indian Police Service, and gave it constitutional status. Now, there was a view there, it was a heady time of optimism, there was a view that now that we are governed by Indians, the police will also be governing for Indians. Now, really speaking, leopard doesn't change its spots so quickly, so things haven't changed really in 75 years, and you can see that in interactions between the citizen and the state. But we have perpetuated colonial institutions without thinking about how to reform them for the modern age. It is something that we should start thinking about today. And the last point, which is something that Vishwam also mentioned, which is this point about preventive detention and law and order. Now, in my view, the fundamental rights chapter of the Constitution is rightly celebrated. It was a chapter that was not present in the Government of India Act 1935. It was a new addition. And to that extent, it is certainly worthy of celebration that India chose at that post-war moment to go with the flow and a constitution that is based on an idea of universal human rights for all. That is the fundamental basis of the constitution. But we can't stop there. Because the Constitution of India, what it gives with one hand, takes away with the other. The fundamental rights chapter is riddled with significant exceptions and exceptions that are responsible for a lot of everyday actions that we see governments take today. The reason why sedition continues to be a crime, not just in the IPC for the last 75, but in a different name in the BNS today, is because of the fact that there are wide exceptions that are provided in Article 19.2, brought in through the First Amendment, that is the same Constituent Assembly sitting as the first Parliament, brought in through the First Amendment to the Constitution in 1950-1951. And that wide exception to Article 19, provided in Article 19.2, is the reason why the Supreme Court upheld sedition, and sedition continues to be good law in this country. These are conscious choices that were made by the framers of the Constitution. Now, why did they make these choices? When I was looking into this book, it seemed to me to be an extremely curious choice, and I chose preventive detention as the example. Because here is a fundamental rights chapter that is rightly celebrated. And the crown jewel of that fundamental rights chapter is Article 21. But Article 21 is followed by Article 22, a provision that actually, except for one case in our constitutional law class taught by Professor URI on Anwar Ali Sarkar, other than that, we didn't even look at this constitution, Article 22. We didn't look at these boards that were set up for preventive detention. We didn't look at this provision at all. But it's there, right there, staring at us in the face after Article 21 and before the freedom of religion in Article 25 and 26. And what does Article 22 say? Article 22 essentially legitimizes preventive detention, but it provides a lot of safeguards that you can do it, but not very easily. We can get into the details of that. Now, this struck me as a particularly curious choice because, as I've written in my book, preventive detention laws have been a weapon of choice of the colonial administration in dealing with Indian freedom fighters. Most notably, the Rowlatt Act, officially titled the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act, authorized police to detain persons without trial, trial without a jury, and search without a warrant. It was pointedly directed at diluting the protections offered by the CRPC to freedom fighters who had been accused of crimes. Gandhiji had termed it a black act, a law of such character that no self-respecting nation can accept it. So when the time came that Indians were in charge of their own destiny and could rewrite all colonial laws, one might be forgiven for thinking that preventive detention, the signature symbol of the lawlessness of the British Raj, would be consigned to the dustbin of history. There could be a simple line in the Fundamental Rights chapter that would have been preventive detention in all its forms shall be prohibited, like we did for untouchability. It could have been something of that kind. Instead, the founding fathers hedged their bets on this. The drafting committee, by a vote of 2:1, took the pragmatic step of incorporating safeguards to the use of preventive detention. This gave rise to the remarkable position that a chapter on fundamental rights dedicated a long provision to the power of the state to preventively detain citizens. And this was the antithesis of everything that the freedom movement had stood for. And the police could now simply come and lock up citizens whenever it wanted without giving any reasons whatsoever. And this is not theoretical. Most states in India have some version called the Gundas Act, some version of the Gundas Act. And our crime and punishment team was doing some research that the number of people arrested, and I keep saying this in every lecture that I give because I find this so shocking, and this is NCRB data from 2021. The number of people arrested in India every year, that year, was around 63,000. I may be getting it wrong by 1 or 2,000 here or there, but around 63,000 people were arrested of offences committed under the IPC. In comparison, the number of people detained, that is without warrant or charge, is 88,000 people. Many more people detained in the country than arrested under the procedure established by law. And that is because of a choice that is exercised by the framers of the Constitution. There is a reason. There is a reason why this choice was exercised, and I think, and this is again not to justify. Okay, I have the number here. Actually, the number of people that were arrested were 58 lakh, and the number of people detained were 86.6 lakh. Sorry, I got that wrong. But the Constitution sanctions such a state, and the reason for that is very clear. That the day actually that they were discussing this provision on preventive detention, 8th September, V.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor, continued their work of putting together the draft of this provision and began its clause by clause revision at a time when there was a massive riot in Paharganj. And Paharganj, as those familiar with Delhi will know, is only about 15 minutes away from Parliament House. An article in the Daily Mirror from that day described the area, quote, like a battlefield, its streets filled with dead animals, its buildings ablaze, and the constant pattering of machine gun fire in the air. So members of the Constituent Assembly who were drafting this provision on preventive detention had to come through these riot-strewn areas to come and debate a provision on putting a premium on law and order in the Constitution. There is no doubt that they would think favorably towards giving wider powers to the police to ensure that this kind of situation does not recur. But the irony of the situation is that Paharganj is a local tourist hub in Delhi where you find all kinds of cheap hotels and cheap bars today. It's perfectly peaceful. But the provision on preventive detention continues in the Constitution, and 88 lakh people are detained both under this provision as well as under the various state legislations. So that is why Somnath Lahiri, who was the only card-carrying communist member in the Constitution, in the Constituent Assembly, he described it very evocatively, and people got very angry when he said this, that this is a police constable's constitution. That it seems as if it has been written from the nub of the gun of a police officer. Now that may be overstating, because the fact is that there are many practical constraints that are responsible for the Constitution taking the form that it did. But the thing is that we chose this existing model, this model of the Constitution that exists, because of the fact that we didn't really at that point of time find alternatives that could generate consensus amongst communities. And I've talked about two alternatives since Vishwam has already talked about one. I'm not going to deal in great detail with the Gandhian Constitution. But I'll only say this, is that I find it a big gap that in our constitutional law classes we actually don't study Gandhi. Because we don't tend to think of Gandhi as a legal thinker, which he wasn't. He wasn't. I mean, let's be clear that he wasn't thinking really about law. By the end of his life, he had become quite anarchist and he was quite disillusioned by a lot of what the legal system had to offer. But the fact is that some of his early work essentially talks about the framework for governing a nation. And that framework has broadly two elements which I feel we should discuss to see whether we can develop it further. Work on this has not been done, but I feel like work on this needs to be done. The first is on local governance. This was a cardinal axiom of Gandhian thought that governance should be closest to the people. He said that governance cannot be from Delhi, which is like Everest. Governance has to be closest to the people. And this is an idea that with the 73rd and 74th Amendment, we tried going in that direction. We went from 2 tiers of governance to what I call 2.5 tiers, because the panchayats really don't have full powers the way in which the states and the union does. But just think about it for a moment. Bihar has a population of 13 crores or something like that. This is the population of Germany is 8 crores. The population of South Africa, the whole country is 5 crores. And each of these has 3 tiers of government. And Bihar here has whatever, 1.5 tiers of government. We have got 13 crore people. How are we going to progress as a country if we are not going to decentralize governance? Now, you and I both will think that, immediately if you decentralize, because these are kind of, as he rightly described it, perhaps we are prisoners of a kind of colonial thought. But the moment we think that we are going to decentralize, we think, "Arey, ye to local level corruption hoga, isko kaise khilane padenge, isko kaise khilane padenge, sab paise mangenge." This is how we tend to think. And even in Delhi, I much rather some unnamed bureaucrat sit in the municipal corporation of Delhi take decisions about the roads in my area rather than some local representative. Because you see local representatives, they're close to you, you know everything about them, what is good, what is bad, and you feel let it be some unnamed bureaucrat. But it's not as if that unnamed bureaucrat is also not taking bribes today, right? It's just that we know less about it. So I feel like this is an issue that requires much deeper thought in terms of how do we fulfill this promise, or at least investigate this premise of decentralized governance that Gandhi held as an article of faith. That's point number 1 of Gandhian thought, which I think is very relevant for constitutional law. The second is this idea of duty. And I think this idea of duty is much derided within our legal fraternity. We tend to think that, this is like some value education class, like what your grandparents would tell you, that kind of thing is how we think of this idea of duties. But this is an idea that interestingly has had resonance across political parties in independent India. As if the idea of fundamental duties in the constitution in 51A was brought in by the infamous 42nd Amendment by Indira Gandhi. You see Prime Minister Modi constantly talking about duties. I'll show you many speeches during the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution. Before that Atal Bihari Vajpayee was talking about duties as well. So you're talking about centrists, you're talking about people on all sides of the political spectrum who are talking about this idea of duty. It keeps coming up. But what has happened is that there are 2 things that have happened with Article 51A. Because Article 51A has duties which are, frankly speaking, at the level of kind of banal platitudes. Okay, we must respect international law. We must protect the environment. I mean, but you think that, okay, so what does this mean? How is this going to be enforced? You have some of these questions come up, so then they kind of become also not worth the paper that they are written on. Secondly, the 42nd Amendment has a political history and a political context. It is perhaps the most anti-democratic amendment to the Constitution that was brought about, and in that you are now providing a provision on duty, so everyone will naturally tend to think that this is not worth giving much credence to. But I think this idea of duty, not as a negation of rights, not in this classic Offeldian sense that we think of it, that if I have a right, then you have a duty to respect that right. But this idea of a duty coexisting with the idea of rights is something that requires significant investigation. So these are the 2 aspects of Gandhian thought that I think are critical. And then I'm going to come to this, what he didn't speak about very much, which I think is interesting, is that there was a constitution that was so-called Hindutva constitution at that point of time. This was something that I had unearthed while doing this work. I actually didn't know of the existence of this document till that time. It was not very well known at all. And of course, there is a atmosphere of some fear. As when I wrote this book, of course, it was not a coalition government; it was an NDA government. So there was an atmosphere of some fear that there might be constitutional rewriting and so on. I would like to fundamentally challenge that thesis that at least in this form, that the BJP government would like to rewrite the constitution. I mean, what it would like to do or not to do, I don't know. But in terms of whether this is something that politically it would even think of doing, I find this thought completely laughable. Now, the basis for that is historical. So, if we were to look at the only time when the progenitors, in some sense, of the Hindu right, that is the Hindu Mahasabha led by Savarkar, had a chance to draft the constitution. In 1939, in the Mahasabha session in Calcutta, Savarkar outlined the vision of a future constitution of India. At that time, it's important to note that the Mahasabha, which was a fringe party, had formed a government in Bengal in coalition with the Krishna Praja Party, the Forward Bloc, and the Independent Scheduled Caste Party. This is because all the Congress governments had resigned because the British had taken India into the war without consulting the government. So the Congress government in Bengal had resigned. And so this was the government that was in place. The political context is important. A few years earlier, in the Essentials of Hindutva, which is Savarkar's sort of key treatise, he had said that only those who have their Pitra Bhumi and their Punya Bhumi in the land between the Sindhu River and the Sindhu Sagar could be a Hindu, and Hindustan belonged to Hindus. Now, in Calcutta in 1939, he said that all those who resided in Hindustan, anybody who resides in Hindustan could be a citizen provided they declared an allegiance to the Hindustani state. That did not mean that they could not practice a religion of their choice. Rights regarding their language, religion and culture would be guaranteed. He also said minorities could set up their schools for their own children with state support, provided majorities could also do the same. So states could support religious schools, minority or majority. The entire edifice of Savarkar's constitutional vision was to make the Hindu Mahasabha a mainstream political party. Wanted to sound like a mainstream political party. So the actual task of converting this vision into reality was given to a small group of Maharashtrian Brahmins called the Bopatkar Satkar Vidhi, which was a collective that was set up in Pune. This was the driving force of the constitution of the Hindustan Free State. So first is the interesting idea of this name. They called it the Hindustan Free State. Now this itself is interesting because Hindustan obviously comes from the fact that, and we've had this debate about India and Bharat recently. Savarkar of course says we don't want India, we also don't want Bharat, but we want Hindustan. Yes. So
It's not Hindustan, it is Hindustan.
Correct.
Stan.
Stan.
It is not the name as we say Hindustan, not Hindustan.
Absolutely. It's Hindustan. Yeah. So I think that's the first thing to note. That is Hindustan. Number one. Number two, also very critically, is that they are great admirers of the Irish Free State. Because the Irish Free State is at that time it had become an independent government which had successfully fought the British and had got independence for Ireland. So they decided to merge the two and call it the Hindustan Free State. So this is not, they are saying that we are not sort of indigenous and nativist, we want to be both that, but at the same time we want to be cosmopolitan. Secondly, and I think this is three provisions of this constitution are quite important. It's pretty much like the Constitution of India, as Vishwan rightly pointed out. It's well accepted principles of popular sovereignty, individual freedom, justice and peace, indivisibility of the nation state. But there are three interesting things. First is that there is a ringing endorsement of India's secular nature. Article 7, subclause 15 of the Constitution provided that the Hindustan Free State would have no state religion. Okay, so it is not as if they wanted a Hindu Rashtra through the Constitution. Number one. Number two, Article 711 gave every citizen the freedom to practice and profess their own religion and protect their own culture and language. This is very similar to the provision that exists today. And Article 6 and 7 guaranteed equal citizenship to all with equal civic rights. So no law could treat Hindus and Muslims differently. Now, there are two key differences, is that they were not in favor of a federal government. They wanted a unitary government. And the other key thing is that there were clear political compulsions which were underlying these provisions, as I said, that they wanted political acceptability. They wanted to be seen as a mainstream political party, so they drafted what is a mainstream constitution. And I think this is very important to recognize, particularly in today's milieu. Is it the case that the BJP government believes in Hindutva? Of course it does. I mean, if they try and say that they don't believe in Hindutva, that is nonsense. Of course they believe in Hindutva. It is an abiding doctrine as of everybody in that party. But the fact is that the playing ground for Hindutva is not the constitution. And I think this is a critical distinction that we need to make. History shows us that the playing ground for Hindutva is politics and society. That is where Hindutva continued to operate. So at that point of time, Hindutva doctrine was spreading and the RSS was becoming very popular, particularly amongst refugees who had come in from Pakistan into Delhi and Punjab. It was very popular, but at the same time, at that point of time, the Hindu Mahasabha was proposing a constitution that said that India will not have a state religion. So what explains this dichotomy? This dichotomy is something that you see even today. Even today, when the BJP was confronted with the fact that the constitution is in danger, the BJP said that we actually are the protectors of the constitution, we support the constitution. They did not say that the constitution has provisions that provide for minority rights and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of overt acceptance of the constitution. But the playing ground for Hindutva is different. So when we try and say that the constitution is under threat and it will be completely upended, I think that is actually missing the wood for the trees. The playing ground for that is happening in society, that is happening in our minds and hearts, where we start seeing citizens as Hindus and Muslims and Christians and so on, or as this caste or that caste, but we are not seeing them as citizens of India. And I think that is where our attention regarding equality and secularism must be, in our politics and not in the constitution itself. But we should certainly debate new constitutional ideas, and with this I will end. That this book is not a sign of dismay, that oh, look at this cover, that this preamble is hidden, superimposed with the Union Jack. I mean, this is meant to provoke you. It's meant to provoke you, as it has provoked people, including, I'm very happy to say, Viswam, into reacting. Well, I do want you to react. You can disagree with it. You can say that no, this is nonsense, that this is a great constitution and we must work to ensure that this survives. And I will be fully with you with this, because as I've written very clearly in the book, that my book is not a call, like we mentioned J.S.I. Deepak, to rewrite this constitution, to have a different constitution that is core to our Indic faith. I don't believe that any such thing, there is such pure Indic faith that exists. But at the same time, we must be open to debating new constitutional ideas and criticizing ideas that we think don't have genuine acceptability in society. So it is not a sign of dismay that we should do away with this and we need a new constitution in its place. There is unfinished business from the time of the founding of the nation. The document worked for us in the political context of 75 years back. Some parts of that document, certainly the right to equality, the freedom of religion, the fact that we have protections for minorities, the fact that we have a lot of good ideas as directive principles may continue to work today. But there are certain other parts which don't work. What is the point of having a constitution which declares socialism when every day all of us are seeing naked celebration of wealth, of private wealth? Okay, so we have to rethink these in terms of how do we make it relevant for today's day and age. We cannot really just stick with these ideas and say that it's there in our constitution. So as I've said through the course of this book, India needs to have an honest conversation about its constitution without immediately being labeled politically on one side or the other. It needs to celebrate it, but it also needs to criticize it, because that is the only way that we can nourish the constitution, and it is our duty inside law schools, inside the legal fraternity, to have this debate, because it is only out of this debate that the constitution will endure and constitutional values will endure in this country. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, no, I can. Okay, I'll take it as a question. The first question. So actually, the Vaishnav Janato is interesting. As in the reason actually why I started with Vaishnav Janato was because of and what I write a little bit later in the first chapter is that how many of you have seen this film called Water that Deepa Mehta directed about widows in Banaras? So hasn't seen it, but I strongly recommend that you see it, because I think a lot for many reasons. It's a great film. I think that's one of the key reasons to see it. That time my favorite actress was Lisa Ray, who was also there in that film. She had become very famous because she was in this Nusrat video called Afri, the original one, not the Coke Studio one. But now I feel really old saying all this. Yeah, that's true. Although I would like to believe otherwise. But so in that film, there's a scene at the end where Gandhiji is pulling into the station in a train, and there is this, without giving too much away, there is this young child widow who is handed over to Gandhiji's entourage, saying that just hope that she has a better life with him. And the message that Gandhiji gives in that little sermon that he does is that if you want a better country, you must look within. And this is a message that strongly resonates with me. That instead of necessarily starting by saying this judge did this wrong, this politician did this wrong, we must all look within to say what are the choices that we are making in our everyday lives. And it could be to the extent that Vishnu said that sitting down and speaking is an example of decoloniality. We can disagree or debate it, but it is a sign that there is every act that we do as it is laden with meaning. So the reason why I used Vaishnava Janato was because of the fact that the Gandhiji basic message was that you have to look within and be good within. And I think this is the core. I mean, it's certainly very far away from law, but this is the core to a good society. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, and this is also where it got interesting, is that the film Water, they wanted to shoot it in Banaras, of course, because it was based in Banaras. But at that point of time, a young MP, that time he was a MP, Yogi Adityanath, was one of the key figures who prevented this shooting from happening in Banaras, saying that you cannot shoot a film about widows in Banaras. This is offensive to our sentiment. There was a lot of hostility at that point of time. And whether right or wrong, we may agree or disagree, but we certainly want to live in a country where everybody should have a right to make a film, as long as that film is within the realm of reason. And so they had to go away. So the shooting was not done in Banaras, and so that whole set, though it seems to be of Banaras, is actually in Sri Lanka. So, and it was very interesting that it released on exactly the same time that the Constitution was celebrating its Golden Jubilee. So around the 28th of January 1950 was that time. It wasn't released, sorry, this thing was happening at exactly the same time as the Constitution was celebrating its Golden Jubilee. And at that point of time, there were all these praises of the Constitution and the freedom of speech and expression that were being said in Delhi in the Supreme Court. But at the same time, not more than 800 kilometers away, there was a film crew that was not being allowed to shoot a film on, and it's not a film that is in that sense offensive to Hindus in any way. It's not that Deepa Mehta is a very well-known director. It's a very good film, and so that's the reason. And so that's the reason I thought that it was an interesting point to start with. That a book about the Constitution does not necessarily have to start with jargon and legalese. Since I was only criticizing that, I thought that we started in a way that would be accessible to a wider audience. But on the details of the content of Vaishnava Janato itself, I'll come to it as the question gets asked, because that will get us into some heavy spiritual terrain. Okay. But thanks. I'll sit and take the questions.
Please come.
Thank you for the insightful session on your book. Now the floor is open for question and answer. I would like to ask Faizan Mustafa sir to please start the question and answer session with a question.
So thank you very much, and what a treat it was really to hear Arghya, and this is a very important book for anyone who is interested in Indian Constitution. But as he himself said, that one may disagree with the cover, because in this Constitution, if something is really indigenous, if I can remove that first expression of "we the people," borrowed from the UN Charter and American Constitution, and one two slogans from French Revolution, it was not there in the Government of India Act. Government of India Act is one example of a constitution which did not have a brain. So I don't think that Union Jack and Indian Preamble can go together. I can understand if you have Article 22 or if you have 356 or a number of other articles which are a continuation of colonization. Therefore, my first question is that many years ago, some 24 years ago, I was assisting the Prime Minister of Ethiopia in law reform there. And one day it was a civil service university like the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy in Missouri, that the director came to me and with great pride, I think it was a second day of my arrival in Addis Ababa, he said, well, you know, Professor Mustafa, we were never colonized. And Ethiopians take great pride. They had an uninterrupted monarchy of 5,000 years starting from King Solomon. And it will end with Haile Selassie. So we were never colonized. And that is so great. So my immediate answer was, not exactly. You were colonized for 4.5 years by the Italians, and that's how you have Eritrea now. But nevertheless, colonization is good. Had you been colonized like us, you would have been a far more developed country. So colonization is also the symbol of modernity. And it is symbol of progress. And therefore, if our constitution have colonial imprint, let it be. Because many ideas which we have incorporated in the constitution, we have borrowed from the West. And in the civilizational history, such borrowing is good. So don't you think that colonization should not be such a hated word?
Yeah, I think this is a good political context to discuss this. I would say that seeing it in good and bad terms is perhaps a bit binary, because I agree with sir that it doesn't mean that just because something is colonial, it is bad. I don't think that we can be as simplistic to say that everything that is colonial is bad. Actually, Ambedkar has a great quote saying that we are 200 years late to this journey. Most of these ideas have already been discussed and debated and been handed down to us as well accepted ideas, not just in the West, but well accepted ideas by humanity. We all think that democracy is good, generally. It started there. So I think that there is nothing, that's why he says there is no shame in borrowing. I agree with that. This is not something where you have to run some Turnitin software and you'll be accused of plagiarism, like you all might be. But the fact is that here is one place that you can legitimately borrow. So I think to that extent, as in the mere fact of borrowing is not problematic. I think there are two areas where I do think that there is need to think a little bit more for ourselves. The first is this point that briefly was mentioned by Viswam, which is that it's not as if, sir, India has been a blank slate constitution. Okay? Because there was this idea, and this is going back to, let's take family law, right? This idea that there is a Hindu law and there is a Muslim law. I mean, this idea seems to suggest that basically the beginning of all law happens with this codification exercise that is done by me and at that point of time. So the fact is that it is not a blank slate, and because it is not a blank slate, it is important to understand as to what methods of governance have held sway in this country for long before colonial rule, and whether there is any merit to looking at some of them. And in that context, one which I think is actually very critical, which has been brought back through the 73rd Amendment, is this idea of the panchayat. Okay? The idea of the panchayat and the local government is actually a very critical and old idea, as in which is essentially democracy in practice. So one is that there is a need for us to look at these ideas which have had sway in the Indian subcontinent for a long period of time, and to try and see as to whether there is any room for them within the constitution. That's point number one. Point number two, as far as coloniality is concerned, I mean, and it's very hard to give a very simple definition, because there is a book that there is a chapter that Arghya Sengupta has written, which is actually good in terms of what do we mean when we call something colonial. And it's in Udit Bhatia's collection. It's an interesting chapter to read, and he gives many options. But the simplest, the way in which I look at the idea of coloniality, is the fact that the state towers over the citizen. Okay? So it is not so much that we have taken an idea such as democracy or equality or federalism from somewhere else. I mean, that borrowing is not only perhaps understandable, but also justified. But this idea that we have a state that towers over the citizen, which is something that we all see in everyday actions of people, in the way in which they approach government service. Like the simple use of the word saham, right? Going with folded hands. Okay. Now this idea is an idea which actually, I don't know how it is in Ethiopia, but is an idea that doesn't exist, say, for example, in the tribes in Meghalaya. Okay, we've done a long project in Meghalaya for the last 2 years. And the fact is, you should see I was amazed actually to see the way in which people talk to government servants. People talk to government IAS officers as if they are their equals. Okay, so this is this idea of the state towering over the citizen. If we were to inquire into this idea, this is a deep-rooted colonial idea, and I think this is an idea that, as citizens of an independent nation for the last 75 years, is something that we really need to review. So these were the 2 points that I had, but I agree that we can borrow, we should borrow where it's good.
No, I take the point about some of the tribal communities, but Indian society as such, let us go back to ancient India, was absolutely hierarchical. Whether it was in terms of caste or whether in terms of those who have power, so there will be lower caste people who cannot dare to even sit on the court, and they can't even eat with us. So this kind of feeling that there are superiors and inferiors, I think it predates our interaction with the British.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. And I think here I would like to draw everyone's attention to this really good piece of work in Kannada, which is an English translation by D.R. Nagaraj, called The Flaming Feet. Now, this is we have many chapters, but one is he's an Ati Shudra scholar, as he says himself, not a Dalit, but an Ati Shudra scholar, and very well renowned for his works on Ambedkarite thought. And there is a chapter which is a kind of fictitious account of a conversation between Gandhi and Ambedkar. And this also goes back to the point about why, what Vishwan was saying earlier, in terms of why was Ambedkar so disenchanted with the constitution and takes this turn away from law to a moral act of giving up Hindu religion and doing this mass conversion. And Nagaraj says there, and which is to your point about hierarchical superiority and inferiority, he says that this is an endemic feature of Indian society. and we are a feudal society, a hierarchical society. The British have only come in and added further to that. They've changed who the superior is and the inferior is, but the idea is at its core there. Now he says that how do we get out of this? We get out of this, and this is where he makes a very interesting point, that law is an external intervention to try and get out of this. And he says that yes, it's not as if we don't need it. Of course we need it. We of course need reservations, but it would be foolish of us to think that caste, which is an institution of 2000 years plus, will go away with reservations in 75 years. Okay? It will not go away like that. But what we also need, and this is coming, and this is where he says that Gandhi was also right. So Ambedkar is right in saying that yes, we need the state to act in favor of the untouchable communities, but we also need to heed Gandhi's point, and this is in response to a lot of Dalit activism in Karnataka, which was very critical of Gandhi. But we need to heed Gandhi's point that this change will not happen unless there is a cleaning of minds and hearts of people. That people have to change from within. Now, this may all seem very fancy gobbledygook because people have to change. That's all good. But the point is that there is a deeper point there in terms of the fact that we will change. Certainly, we need external intervention, but we also need some version of internal purification. Some self-purification is needed. And so I think this hierarchical superiority and inferiority is a factor in every society, for it will not go away. But to have an even keel of egalitarianism, we certainly need law, but we also need those societal conditions in which that law will be acceptable. So I think we need both. Simply saying that law and the courts will deliver it for us will not work.
The other point on which I want you to reflect is a subject in which I am also interested. This whole idea of constitutional theology. So this idea of constitution being a holy book, I have written a piece that this is not right. Every criminal, would say, I have full faith in the constitution. And I have full faith in the judiciary. And this faith is a theological term. And it brings in some kind of blind beliefs. Of course, Article 25 permit you to go to the hell in your own way, if you really want to go. But judges' obsession with theology, and not as much with the constitution. On the whole question of freedom of religion, this whole essentiality doctrine has converted Indian judges into a clergy. They have become the priest. So what is my religion today? A judge trained in common law will tell me, rather than a mullah or a pandit or a priest. And look at their judgments. Nothing about religion will be relevant. Still, they will quote scriptures. One of the biggest problem of Shah Bano was what? The case was under 125 and 127. 127 says you will be exempted from your liability to pay the divorcee if an amount due under the customary law on divorce has been paid. Prior to Shah Bano, even Justice Krishna here in Bai Tahira and Fazlan B has held that dower is that amount, and if it is reasonable, if it is unreasonable, the court will enhance it. If it has been paid, your liability under 125 comes to an end. Krishna here was wrong, and Chandrachud was right that dower is not an amount due on divorce. It is a consideration of marriage. It is to be paid as a mark of respect by the husband as they are starting a new life. Therefore, if dower is paid, you are not exempted. The judgment should have ended here. Unnecessarily, Justice Chandrachud goes to Quran and then quotes the scripture to say, look, in Quran also it is written, those who are righteous, they pay maintenance. And then many Muslims say, we are not righteous. So, in privacy, on right to die, you read any judgment, from nowhere you will see that some scripture is quoted. So, what, in your opinion, is this obsession of our judges with religion?
I think the short answer is that we are a very religious country. I think, and the judges are not immune from that. And my sense is that there is a deeper point here, which is the fact is that I think the way in which we deal with text in India is not the way in which legal texts are considered in the West. And I think this is I found this, and just a personal note, if you're not, I found a great difference when I was a student and when I was teaching administrative law in Oxford. I found a great difference in the way in which text is given some sanctity, which we don't have here. And this is not to say that one is good and one is not good. Actually, we here have even when you're doing law, we have a more general understanding. Like you were saying that Justice Krishna's view, that what is right, what is reasonable. And the text can be molded to get to that understanding, even if it's not exactly saying what it is saying. And this, of course, goes back to the fact that we are not we are a society that is based on oral histories for a long period of time. We are not a society that, a lot of its scripture is written down and so on and so forth. So I think there is a point here about the sanctity of the written word. And so I think that when judges are meant to be interpreting the Constitution, they ought to be within a certain remit, the remit that we think is reasonable for lawyers and judges to be in. But I think most of the time, as if the text is seen, and maybe this is a strong word, but as a suggestion. It's not seen as binding in that sense. And we can see numerous examples of this, and this happens in courts on a fairly regular basis, that the text may say something, but what is happening is something completely different. And you can see it in most public interest litigation. We have completely forgotten about the text of the Constitution itself. We are not even asking any questions relating to Article 32 anymore. We are not even asking any questions relating to standing, because it's not as if public interest litigation means that any person can go and come to court on any issue. It means you are relaxing rules of standing. Relaxing rules of standing is not to say that standing does not matter. Okay? So if you are relaxing standing, then questions should arise. In terms of, as they did in Sabrimala, you can come one way or the other, but the Indian Young Lawyers Association, does it have the standing to bring this case? Justice T.S. Puttaswamy, does he have the standing to bring this case? We should be able to ask these questions. We don't. My problem is that we don't ask these questions, and I think some of this, and this is not a direct answer to sir what you said, but some of this pontification on matters, particularly in relation to religion, doesn't seem to be on the basis of the fact that one, the text itself isn't enough. There's a feeling that the text isn't enough. And two, because we are a religious society and people understand religion, I think if judges think that if we can talk in that canon, then perhaps there will be greater acceptability. I feel like could be a question.
Just two more questions. One is small one. So on the question of duty, I got a little confused because as someone who has very rightly criticized Article 22, the duty provision is generally not found in the liberal constitutions. It is found in the socialist constitution. Duty is an idea which the right-wingers like, because one of the characteristics of a right-winger would be the control. And in our own tradition, we said that the only right you have is the right to do your duty. Kartavya pradhan thing. And then you see that even Mrs. Gandhi could not insert it in part 3. And therefore could not make rights and duties correlated. Lately, again, you see too much of reference to duties. Therefore, don't you think that the whole duty emphasis may eventually dilute the liberties in the Constitution?
Yeah, so this is a very valid point, but I think there needs to be a clarification in terms of how I see duties. The way in which I see duties is not duties towards the state or duties towards the community. I think this is actually the key conflation that I think has happened in trying to make duties part of a legal text. Okay. That we have tried to make it, give it the flavor of impossibility by saying that these are duties in that sense towards the state to stand up when the national anthem is being sung. This kind of duty. But my view is, and it doesn't operate in the field of legal theory as much as it operates in the field of moral theorizing, which is the fact that there are duties and there should be duties that we owe to each other as citizens. And I think that this is an idea that requires a deeper degree of inquiry. This is how I think this duty discussion, which as you rightly said, currently in the political discourse, this duty discussion is duty towards the state. Be good citizens, go for conscription, that kind of idea. But this is how I feel that this idea can be channeled towards a more meaningful understanding that is truer to our ethos, which is of duty, whether you call it kartavya, which is kind of slightly transactional, or you call it dharma. The idea of a duty is a duty towards each other. I think this is the way in which I'm trying to understand.
And my last question is about this whole Hindu Mahasabha constitution. So, disappointed with the hate all around, some 4 years ago, I did a piece saying that now the foot soldiers will not get satisfied with anything which is just symbolic. And therefore, something more is to be done. And in that controversial piece, after which all my feminist and civil libertarian friends have abandoned me, I said, let us talk of Hindu Rashtra. And let us look at what are the options of Hindu Rashtra. And I thought that, well, people in India would not like to go the Saudi Arab way and go the Pakistan way, but let us think of Greece, where you say in the constitution, acknowledge Trinity and nothing else is there. Or the jurisdictional model of secularism like England, where king is the defender of faith and head of the Anglican church, but everybody has freedom. But what surprised me, and I have not read this anywhere, I have quite a collection on Hindutva, but that constitution's text I have not seen. And in none of the Hindutva book you find any discussion about the constitution which Arghya has mentioned in the book. But I look at it differently. I had said in that piece, for instance, that even if Hindutva is declared or Hinduism is declared to be the dominant spiritual heritage of India, which the Buddhism has been declared in the Sri Lankan constitution, nothing much is going to change on the ground because all fundamental rights would be available to whomsoever is the citizen of India. And as I said, that like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, we are not going to say that people from X community will not have right to vote or to become Chief Justice or President, you should be a Hindu or this and that. What is surprising me, of course, is the personality of Savarkar, very contradictory, an atheist talking of religion, like Jinnah, not a practicing Muslim, but using religion for politics. Savarkar opposing cow this protection, so to say. But a man who is coming up with this formula, defining people on the basis of allegiance to a religion and to a state, and then saying a state shall not have any religion. Don't you think that this is hypocrisy at its best?
Absolutely, heavily. And I think that the reason why this happens is that, and this is why I think it's important for all constitutional lawyers to be very cognizant of the political circumstances in which these events happen. And that's why I keep harping on this fact, is that this is entirely contradictory and hypocritical because of the fact that there is the political context demands that the Hindu Mahasabha become more centrist. Because it's in coalition, it's a fringe party, it has never had any success. And the reason why it has never had any success is because of the fact, as sir mentioned, that Savarkar, who's the head of the Mahasabha, its kind of spiritual guide, is this person who himself is an atheist, who organizes these intercaste marriage swayamvars Okay, so in no sense is in that sense a Sanskritic Hindu. And on the other hand, the Congress is headed by a person who is dressed like a sadhu, who is going around proclaiming that Ram Rajya is his goal. So essentially, who is a Hindu and who is not a Hindu and who will a Hindu support? This question has become a little bit difficult for people to answer, and so Savarkar's popularity is naturally very, very limited. So at that point of time, he sees a chance because he's come into power in Bengal. So he sees a chance that he wants to be acceptable. He actually wants to be called in by the British government for discussions because the Congress is not discussing the future of the constitutional developments in India. He wants a seat at that table at that point of time. If you remember, the Cripps mission was visiting, and there was talk that a cabinet mission plan would happen, and he wanted to be one of the delegates there. So one is that there is this need for political acceptability, which is why there is this toning down of this rhetoric. But two, and I think this is also equally important, is that the reason why it can be done without too much cognitive dissonance, and this is a point that I repeatedly made, is that Hindutva as a doctrine for both the Hindu Mahasabha as well as as well as much more the RSS, which is kind of on the up at that point of time, whereas Hindu Mahasabha is kind of on the wane, is a doctrine that operates in interpersonal relationships in society. Is not a doctrine that operates in the realm of law and the constitution. So as you rightly said, and I agree with you, that if somebody, even today, suppose by some magical majority, and that coalition parties support the fact that India shall be a Hindu Rashtra is brought in as whatever, Article 1A of the Constitution. Okay. No difference will be made on that. I agree with sir on that. But the political dispensation also knows very well that no difference will be made on the ground. But the difference will truly be made if, and this is where the point about looking inward comes, if when we see someone clad in a burqa, the first thing we think is that, okay, Muslim, okay, not citizen. The moment we see someone wearing saffron, the first thing we think is, oh, RSS. This is where it will start hurting us. As if this is the thought that happens in our minds when we see people who are different from us. And that is why I think there is certainly this duplicity that exists in this political thought. But I think in that duplicity is also a message for everyone who is right thinking and bothered about hate in the country from wherever it comes from, whichever side, is that it's important to know that the focus of that hate is in our politics and in our society and not particularly as lawyers, first up in the Constitution.
Yeah, please now.
Just one question, sorry. I just take one question. Since I mentioned that the flavor of decoloniality has gone two ways, and these are really diverse ways, where one is where the liberal constitutionalists are saying that we are identifying points of coloniality within the constitution and making a concerted effort to water it down. So, right? So that's in the spirit of the provincializing Europe, the book by Dipesh Chakraborty, is that we don't reject everything only for being Western, but we don't also universalize it as the only truth, right? And the second strand is that of the right wing, which says that the constitution, the fact that we have a constitution itself is a Christian document, right? To have one book which is the answer to all the questions in the world is itself a very Eurocentric and a very Christian idea. And so even the question of having a constitution is being now debated. And both of them are using the same terminology of decoloniality. And one, in my opinion, is very dangerous, and the other is a good concerted effort. So how do you think that reconciliation of decoloniality can happen where it has diverged into these two strands?
Yeah, I think this is an ideological battle. It is a contest over the meaning of a particular idea, and it is becoming what is called an essentially contested concept. But as I think it's important for all of us to realize that the idea of decolonization is an idea that originated with the liberal post-colonial left. Okay. Some of the theoretical work on this has been done by Frantz Fanon, who everybody quotes, very famous political theorist from Martinique, a French colony. But most of that work, and in the Indian context, there's great writing by Partha Chatterjee and Dipesh Chakraborty, both historians and political scientists. Ashish Gandhi, of course, Ashish Gandhi has a kind of psychological flavor with some of his writings, but I mean, purely if you're looking for good political literature on this, there's a lot of good writing on coloniality, which he has summarized well in terms of the fact that we can accept some of this colonial thought, but also not think that it is necessarily universal in its values. So I think that is the dominant trend of decolonial thought. I don't think actually that there is an alternative right-wing view of what decolonization means. I don't think it is there yet. Yes, there are some stray signs based on no evidence whatsoever that this is a Christian conspiracy of some kind. I don't give much credence to it. I mean, there is really no, in that sense, good theoretical work that has come out of certainly the Hindu right in India as an on what decolonization can mean. There is certainly an idea that it is a negation of all that is colonial. Okay. So today what you see is we are in that silly season of decolonization where we are changing names of Aurangzeb Road to APJ Abdul Kalam Marg, you are doing whatever, Allahabad to Prayagraj, that kind of thing. And it is kind of happened in most countries. And again, the classic example of this kind of silly season of decolonization is your criminal laws, right? Where it is exactly the same thing that you've done, you've just given it an Indian name, which is, we can have a separate discussion on that. But I think that there is really no theoretical construct here. So I think that there is only one winner, which is the idea of decolonization as a critique of the universalism of Western political thought. And I'm yet to see a good critique from them.
Rahul, who's our constitutional law teacher, I suppose.
Yeah, so I have a question. Would you rather describe the Constitution as an imperial document rather than a colonial? Would you rather describe the Constitution as an imperial document rather than a colonial document? Because with reference to post-colonial theory, Edward Said has claimed that imperialism concerns itself with the discursive formations that lead to and sustain colonization. And I think I have a very pertinent example that illustrates this from the Constituent Assembly debates, if I may read it out. So Raj Bahadur, speaking of begging in India on the 1st of September 1949, he claims that we give alms guided by faulty notions and sentiments. Moreover, our climatic conditions also result in lethargy and laziness in the habits of our poor. This is also accounted for the abnormal number of beggars in the land. Some people turn beggars only because they are too lazy to work. They fill their stomach without caring, without earning their livelihood by honest work. They simply live on alms and do not work. They are a burden on society. Now, I'd like to point out here that this is the reference to the influence of climatic conditions on how people become lazy is what is known as popularly known as ethnoclimatology, which was the kind of work that was propounded by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who had a profound influence on the poor law in England. And she had a eugenic connection as well, connection to the eugenic movement. So, and this actually has a profound influence on the criminal law as well, because the anti-begging laws are used to, they are in fact used as a catch-all instrument. So in this sense, would you say that all of this, when we speak of the Constitution as an imperial document, we are referring rather to the internalization of Western values and not just borrowing Western values for convenience or familiarity? Do you think there's a difference between internalization of values and borrowing them for convenience and familiarity? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there is a difference. I think there is a big difference, and I think most of our borrowing, while familiarity or convenience may have provided the veneer of reason, but there is an internalization that has taken place, and an internalization that is based, not in this this is a retrograde example, as in terms of the fact that someone who believes that the the poor are poor because they don't work hard enough. But even if we don't take that, and if we take it on the positive side, as in if you were to look at ideas of whether it is liberty, equality, or fraternity, or our fundamental rights, and so on and so forth, I think there is an internalization of the fact that there are certain values which have come from elsewhere that is good for Indian society at this point of time and in the moment that it is. Now, what is that moment? That moment is a moment where we have finally yanked off whatever years and years of the colonial yoke, and now we are free. But we are free and we are poor. So at this point of time, what is it that we need? We need a political stability, which the best scope for that comes from existing institutions that have worked elsewhere and provided that political stability. Two, we need economic progress, and that economic progress will come from a large state. The entire idea in the directive principles of the large state, which is how people will ultimately prosper. So these two ideas are ideas that have been taken from different places, one from communist theory, one from Western liberal thought, but both of them have been internalized. So you're absolutely right in saying that borrowing was not a cavalier act. It was not a cavalier act that, oh, it's there, so let's take it. No, there was an actual view that this is good for us. Okay. As far as the semantics is concerned on imperial and colonial, I mean, maybe you disagree, there is not semantics, maybe there is something deeper there. I mean, I really very honestly don't have a view on this as in terms of what we should call it, but the idea of an empire, I mean, of course, it goes back to the fact that it's been said that India has always been a contest between empires and kingdoms. The empires ruling out of Delhi and kingdoms from various parts of that country. So maybe there is a nice way to relook at Indian federalism as a contest between empires and kingdoms. But I really haven't thought very much about whether we should call it the imperial constitution.
The question and answer floor is now open for all, and due to paucity of time, we will only taking the 3 questions. So please keep your questions. Please say.
Let's take some. I mean, unless you are positive, I'm happy to take some.
Okay, then please.
Very good afternoon. So I'm Divya from Sixth Year. As you have talked about and shed light as well as talked as a pressing issue that there should be decentralization in the system, and we are standing in a state which is a living laboratory of the Panchayati Raj system. Bihar was the first state to grant reservation to the female, 50% of the seats to the female in the third-tier system. So in system, we talked about 2 types of things. One is that 3 organs are there, that is at union level, state level, and third at the Panchayati Raj level. And some of the experiments do come, like the South Africa has come up with an experiment that there are different power centers in the form of different capitals. Jagan Mohan Reddy thought of bringing it in the form of making 3 capitals, one administrative capital at Kurnool, then judicial capital, and then an executive capital. And not only this, there has been demand by the people of the Simanchal region of the Bihar, that is the Katiyar, Kishanganj region, that there should be a mini capital or a sub capital of the Bihar at Purnia. It's a long demand, long-standing demand since the time Faneswar Nath Renu has written his Mailan. So it's a long demand. So, sir, what do you think? And you have also said that in Bihar there's only just 1 and 1.5 type of system. So, what sort of model you would suggest to bring more robust decentralization of power? And secondly, will this decentralization by making different power centers in the form of power capital is sustainable for the functioning of a state like Bihar or functioning of a vast democracy like India in particular? Thank you so much.
We take a few questions together.
Yes, sure.
So my question is with regards to Hindu Mahasabha's constitution on Hindustan Free State. So it was argued that Savarkar's idea of 2 classes of citizens, firstly, one having Pitri Bhumi in India and having Indic origins, and secondly, the citizens who have been residents but do not essentially have Pitri Bhumi in India. So I think it's on the face it's against the ideals of equality, because in the long run, it is bound to create problems. And on equality itself, I think the constitution drafted by Constituent Assembly wins big. So, what's the response?
Please.
So I'm Anurag from 15. So in a very famous debate between Dr. Shashi Tharoor and J. Deepak, when again Dr. Tharoor made this argument that Savarkar and Hindu Mahasabha, then there's a very specific reply by Sai Deepak that they are not willing to bound by what Hindu Mahasabha set up, for that matter Savarkar's idea. They have new ideas up their head. So for example, there are utterances by various chief ministers. So that's number one. So because your Hindutva constitution argument had two prongs. Number one, that for you said that for Hindutva, the playing ground for Hindutva is political. But I think just to give one example, CNRC, for example, many people know it is just a project, one step in the Hindutva project. So therefore, inevitably, inexorably, the playground will become the constitution. So that's number one. And second, sir, they are not willing. So as though I myself subscribe to this so-called right-wing ideology, but nonetheless, I'm asking this question that they are not, they are not willing to bound by historical examples. They have new ideas of their head. So therefore, they have, for example, Sai Deepak is somebody, as Vishnu sir very rightly elaborated this argument. So those are the two.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, Gaurav Tripathi, I'm a fifth year student of BLLB Honours in Constitution Law. Recently, we had honor of watching a panel discussion which was moderated by you and the guest, Professor Timothy and Mr. Gautam Bhatia. The entire context revolved around the idea of free speech. I wanted to come to the question of Hindu Mahasabha, but I think already a lot has been said, so I will jump onto something else. I have one precise question with respect to the exact term mentioned in your book, the Colonial Constitution. When we talk about constitution, constitutional law classes, it is not just bare text of constitution. It is rather the interpretation that we talk about. It is rather the way it has been taken interpretation by courts, by jurists, or whatever means present. Is this coloniality that we were discussing upon has been something which continued even after the text of constitution came into being, with just one reference to it, the idea of sedition as it was discussed by you yourself. The section 124A, which is Macaulayan thing, continued thereafter. Judiciary, in one or the other way, serving it, somehow propelled in most of the judgments. We had BNS, the new criminal law, courts, whatever we call it. I had honor to work on criminal law things with Professor Dr. Faizan Mustafa, sir. We found one very interesting thing. The clause 150 is very much same to what sedition actually continued to. And I'm very confident even judiciary is somehow going to serve it. So are we colonized in terms that our institutions are colonized in a way that they think somehow these concepts are to be served? That's precisely my question.
I'll take these and then if there's one last one, I can take them. So first on power centers and decentralization. First, I think there are two different points here. I think different capital cities are symbolic political acts. Right? Symbolic political acts can also have meaning, as in certain cases there could be historical reasons as to why there are different kinds of capitals. Jabalpur being the seat of the Madhya Pradesh High Court is one such historical reason for that. But there could be several places where it has meaning. But typically speaking, these are symbolic political acts meant for keeping different political constituencies happy. So I don't think that we should confuse the creation of different capitals with decentralization. I think by decentralization, I simply mean devolving power closer to the people. Capital cities don't do that because of the fact that it's still that same tier of government. Yes, that capital may now be a little bit closer to you. Okay, physically, if you are in Simanchal, then it will be a little bit closer if it's in Purnia, but it doesn't mean that government is coming closer because it's the same officer who's traveling from Patna to that place for a few months on few years on transfer and then it's going to come. On decentralization, what my more positive thought is that I think that first we need to do a study in terms of the matching up levels of government with populations. So my sense is that we need to think about village level, taluk level, district level, and state level, and ultimately as different units, distinct units with financial powers. Okay, this idea has to be worked out. It may be different in different places because in some cases with greater population it might be needed. In some cases maybe one tier less is needed. But the basic idea is that each of these tiers should be independent. It should have financial powers. It should have executive powers, and it should have some legislative powers as well, which is very different from what we have currently. So I think the core idea is that we need to think of levels between the state and the local village. Okay, and that cannot only be one, and we need to think about ways and evidence-based means of devising those. So currently, if I were to just give you an example, if a new district, if a new court is being set up, a district court should be set up only on the basis of A, population, and B, also how litigious is the population, how many cases are there in that district. Okay. But currently we find that new district courts are not set up on that reason. District courts are set up because some politician said, okay, set it up here, set it up there. It's on extraneous time. So I think decentralization must mean that. On your question of Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi, as I think Pitrabhumi and Punyabhumi is an antithesis of the idea of equality. There's no doubt about that. Because that essentially would open us up to two classes of citizens. Because if you see this theory, the way this theory has been devised, the theory, it's actually quite interesting, because the theory has been devised to keep, broadly speaking, to keep Muslims and Christians out. Okay, so you have Pitrabhumi, which includes your Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs. Okay, and you have Punyabhumi for the rest of Hindus. Now Savarkar is little bit unhappy with his own formulation because he actually really wants to include Khojas within this, because he thinks Khojas are in that sense educated Muslims as who should be included, but he says, okay, this is a price that I have to pay for this, and same is for Parsis. Okay. So this idea certainly leads to two classes of citizenship, something that Savarkar himself realizes. So when he's actually looking at drafting a constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha does not have this Pitrabhumi Punyabhumi. The constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha says that everyone is citizen of India, and no law can discriminate between citizens on the basis of religion. So this is where this, what sir called hypocrisy, but perhaps this dissonance arises. Now to your question, and I think this is a good one. I don't think the new ideas as far as the Hindu right are formed have developed a degree of maturity. It will happen. It will happen and should happen, because at the end of the day, if you think that you're theoretical, then you're obviously a slave of some theory that you don't know. And in the same breath, I'll say that there is no reason for anyone to be bound by history. Okay, just because the Hindu Mahasabha said something 75 years back does not mean this. But this is not just the Hindu Mahasabha. Let's be clear on one thing. This is about Veer Savarkar. And Veer Savarkar is the preeminent ideologue of the Hindu right today. Okay. Now, can there be another Savarkar? Sure, there can be. Maybe J.S. Deepak is another Savarkar in the making. Just maybe happening now, so we don't know. But the fact is, at this point of time, it is not easy for someone who ideologically subscribes to the Hindu right to say that that is Savarkar's idea. I don't believe it. Okay. So I don't think that response is a response that can be easily taken. But yes, certainly as a person who, I've been criticized many times for working with the BJP government on many issues, but I'd be very happy to see new ideas of the Hindu right come up and to see, if not to necessarily to agree, but to critique. Secondly, on your CAA NRC point, I think that you use the word that anything that happens in society inexorably becomes law or constitution. But I think the key point is that the fundamental intervention happens in society and politics. Okay? Law may take, in some cases, law may be the form in which it manifests. In many cases, it may not be necessary for the law to be that form, because, and a good example of that is the examples that you see of lynching that have happened. Okay? Now, the fact is, Hindu religion does not sanction lynching of this kind at all of anybody. Okay, this is basically the use of religion for politics. Now, in some cases, the use of religion for politics may take the form of law, as it has happened in the CAA NRC case, but in some cases it may not. But I think the focus of attention has to be on politics, and it is not inexorable, in my view, that it will become a part of law or constitution, though it might in some cases, and in that case, you will have to fight it legally or support it legally, whichever your case might be. Because the question on the CAA NRC is, of course, it's a question in terms of how much it serves the Hindutva ideology as well. Because the moment, and in my view, and I've given a lecture in Hyderabad on this, the fact is that the cocktail of the CAA and the NRC, as it makes it part of the Hindutva project, though again, purely speaking legally, there is an arguable case regarding the CAA itself. Okay, in court, of course, if it is not, which it has not been heard for a very long period of time, but it is a case that there can be if I were a lawyer, there could be a reasonable defense that could be made on the fact that there is a rational nexus and so on, though there are difficulties in terms of why you've excluded certain persecuted communities in other cases. Finally, to your question, as far as coloniality is concerned and this sedition, I completely agree with you that I think sedition will be upheld in this. Of course, it's not called sedition anymore, but it will certainly be upheld. It will be seen as a watering down of the provision because it is no longer offences against the government. The word is that it is offences against the state. So there is a distinction that is being sought to be made. And this actually goes back to the question that was earlier asked, that there is a certain kind of colonization of the mind in terms of the fact that there is a notion of the state-citizen relationship that exists in India. And that state-citizenship relationship is something that pervades political parties, dispensations, certainly colonial rule and post-colonial governments. There is a view that the state in India towers above the citizen. That's why in the book where I end, and this was actually the genesis of writing the book, is this scene during COVID where there are about 50 laborers who are, we all remember the scene from the newspaper, there were 50 laborers who were hunched on the ground while they were on their long walk back home. And there was some officer spraying them with disinfectant from the top. And that to me captured what the relationship between the state and the citizen in India was. So the state is towering above with a chemical spray and the citizen is on its haunches below, sitting in this way. So I think that coloniality is something that is, as Sir also rightly said, that it's not something that started or ended with the British. It has a long history and it will also have a long future.
Thank you, sir, for the Q&A sessions. And I now request Vishnu sir to please give vote of thanks.
Sitting or standing? Coloniality does have
Optics also have a future. I'd like to now give the vote of thanks. Before I give the vote of thanks, as is the tradition with book club events, is that we end with book recommendations. One that has already been suggested by Sir is The Flaming Feet by B.R. Nagraj. I think the chapter that he referred to is the last chapter of that book. Self-purification versus self-respect is the title of that chapter. It's a contest, and B.R. Nagraj is one of those very rare Dalit scholars who try to reconcile Gandhi and Ambedkar, which is what the chapter will try to do. There's a beautiful story at the end of that chapter about a Dalit boy coming to meet Gandhiji and what they talk about. So The Flaming Feet by B.R. Nagraj, I think it's a difficult book to find, but if you can find it.
There's an online version that's available on internet.
Right. So there's an online version, you can find it. So that's the first book. The second recommendation will be a contentious one. I think it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And in that spirit, I recommend reading Sai Deepak's India That Is Bharat. Right.
And invite him.
Yeah.
And of course,
I can call him.
please. I think he has already come to Nalsar once.
Yes.
So I think it is a fair chance that we can get him to speak here. I think we'll have a bigger audience.
Next semester.
But with that spirit, I think that's a huge disclaimer that with the spirit and with the disclaimer that you do not have to accept every thought, you can only entertain it, right? Fidelity is not encouraged in when you're doing theory. I took a course called Constitutionalism from the Global South in NLS, where the professor who taught it, Professor Arun Thiruvengaram, said, I've read Sai Deepak's book, and for the lack of academic merit, I could not include it in my course structure. But I still encourage you to read it. And that's also my suggestion to you, that it does not stand up to merit in terms of academic rigor, but as light reading, I recommend it. So those are two book recommendations. I thank Mr. Arghya Sengupta for being here, for giving us his valuable time. It has been a truly insightful 2 hours spent. And I thank Professor Mustafa for always being so encouraging for the book club and for always being here and supporting us. And I thank my volunteers who worked in really hard and in very short spans of time to make all of this come true, right? So Siddharth, Aditi, and everyone else, right? Thank you. A lot of you here who makes these posters in no time at all. It's all great work, and thank you all of you. And we'll see you in the next one. I think in the next semester now, since this is the end of semester. So sorry. But yeah, thank you.
So just a request, a photography session with the book club members, sir, please. Guys, it's a group photography. Anyone who would like to have a good photography can stand up here.
First year boys, नीचे आ जाओ. आ जाओ first year.
ठीक है, सब आ जाएंगे. Three, two, one. Thank you.
सर आपकी इंडिविजुअल फोटो खींच देते हैं.
इंटरव्यू में नहीं है.
रेड शीट पढ़ते हैं ना.